The 1969 moon landing was a huge milestone for our nation and the world. But there are many facts and secrets that most people still don't know about this incredible accomplishment. We've scoured the universe to uncover some of the lesser-known bits of history about the famous NASA journey. Make sure you stick around until the end of the video. We'll tell you exactly what happened to the flag that was famously planted on the moon. Facts First presents 1969 Moon Landing Revisited. 10 Stellar Facts. Click the like button if you remember watching the moon landing. Then, be sure to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and fasten your seatbelts for these astronomical facts. A mission with Russia. Everybody knows that the Americans went to the moon, but did you know that wasn't always the planned idea? It's hard to believe, but the very original idea of going to the moon was with the help of the Russians. Sure, there were tensions between the US and Russia at the time, but then President John F. Kennedy had looked past all that. In his memorable speech to Congress on May 25, 1961, he announced the idea to send a man to the moon. Only 1 month later, he approached the Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev to be a part of the project. Kennedy proposed the moon landing be a joint mission between the two nations. Khrushchev ultimately turned him down. It was obvious at that time that Russia had bigger and stronger rockets than the US did. However, Kennedy wasn't giving up, and he kept his promise to the nation. By the next year, on September 12, 1962, he gave a speech that sparked Americans and set a new generation to achieve the impossible. The speech was spoken at a Houston University football game and was heard by the 40,000 people attending. However, the speech was also broadcast over the radio, allowing many throughout Texas to hear these words. Sadly, another year later, he was assassinated and never saw that dream completed.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Simulation missions. Despite computers being massive machines that took up entire rooms, these devices were responsible for making a trip to the moon possible. Just like modern computers, the data that was stored in these computers was just a series of zeros and ones. But that's what it took to create lifelike simulations of a journey to the moon. After all, they had tested going to the moon before, but they were never prepared to land on the moon and then return to Earth. A lot of testing needed to be done to make an actual moon landing possible, and that's where much of the moon landing itself was figured out. They created custom LM modules that the astronauts could train inside. Just like a wild simulator ride at Disneyland, though not as bumpy, the astronauts could go through a checklist of procedures. NASA didn't just have the main flight crew for this job, they had a backup crew and a support crew who all trained on the same simulator. The simulation was recorded and practiced until they had rehearsed every possible scenario. But even with all this training, there would always be a possibility that they encountered a fatal mistake. Still, they had to be as prepared as possible. The right stuff. Astronauts are pretty clever at smuggling all sorts of things with them on their missions. It's become a tradition to bring some piece of good luck into space. But on the Apollo 11 mission, they didn't just bring fuzzy dice along for the ride. Among several items that were intended to go to the moon itself, some items were taken along because of their historical significance. One of these objects were pieces from the very first airplane flown by the Wright brothers. After all, the first manned flight into the air should have an important place in history. Carefully stashed inside Neil Armstrong's PPK in the lunar module was a small slice of the left propeller and a portion of the wing's fabric. Of course, it had to first be approved by NASA. But for Armstrong, it meant that the biggest step on the moon meant giving respect to those who had first flown in the air. Additionally, Armstrong brought with him a flight pin from the Apollo 1 flight crew. This original crew was intended to land on the moon, but tragically died during a routine test inside one of the return capsules. This flight pin was to honor his fellow astronauts. What would you bring with you into space? Tell us in the comments. A real gas guzzler. Surprisingly, it's a lot easier to launch things into outer space if you just want to go into Earth's orbit. But in the 60s, to launch 3 men into outer space with a moon lander, command module, and service module, you're going to need a lot of fuel to get there. By today's standards, the fuel consumption is unthinkable. But they weren't using ordinary fuel for these special rockets. It was fuel that was custom engineered for NASA. Each rocket section for the Saturn V rocket was intended to give the astronauts and their gear enough power to push past the atmosphere and into outer space. Even after that, to break through the vacuum of outer space, the rockets needed a very special kind of fuel. The first stage booster used kerosene and liquid nitrogen, while the second and third stage boosters used a combination of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. In total, they used nearly 950,000 gallons of fuel for just one mission to the moon. The average American uses 500 gallons of gasoline per year. If you do the math, the Saturn V rocket used enough gas to fuel nearly 2,000 cars for a year. It's no wonder that Elon Musk put one of his Tesla cars into orbit. Think of how much mileage per year an electric car gets in outer space. The lunar module almost crashed. By the time Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins were orbiting the moon, they were already prepping the lunar module for the final descent onto the moon's surface. But they had one problem: where to land. They had several spots that were already picked out from prior survey missions by Apollo 8 and 10, so parking wasn't a problem. You see, landing on a spot that wasn't bumpy would prove to be more difficult than they expected. Even after the lunar module had begun to drift closer to the surface of the moon, they had selected 5 possible spots that looked suitable. But from all the sites they found, the Sea of Tranquility was the best spot. It had the flattest surface, which would pose the least amount of landing risks. However, they were quickly running out of fuel, meaning they were running out of time to land safely. At only 250 feet above the surface, they noticed that their choice landing spot had a large rocky crater in it, so they had to pick another spot quickly. Realizing they only had 90 seconds of fuel left, they made the quick decision to touch down. Good thing they did, or else their vehicle may have needed some roadside assistance. Communion on the moon. When you're on a road trip, it's good to bring plenty of snacks. And while our astronauts were taking a few minutes to relax after finally landing, you might be surprised that one of these astronauts was breaking bread. You see, Buzz Aldrin was a very religious man and thought that it would be the perfect time to take communion. He even brought with him a small chalice and a communion kit that was prepared by the pastor of his hometown church. Aldrin even brought it back, and to this day at Webster Presbyterian Church, they celebrate communion with that chalice on the closest Sunday to the anniversary of the moon landing. Walking on the moon. While the moon's surface has just 1/6 of our gravity here on Earth, there's also no oxygen to breathe. That's why NASA designed spacesuits specially for the moon. It's made to hold everything you need for strolling around the lunar capsule and do some moon experiments too. Even though they designed these suits to be as comfortable as possible, it's not uncommon that astronauts would get a lunar wedgie at some point. After suiting up and leaving their lunar module through a special hatch, Armstrong was the first to step out. Aldrin followed soon enough afterwards, and it was about time they got down to business. They quickly collected some moon dust and rock samples, but also found it wasn't so easy to walk around with less gravity than they were used to. It was a bit like bouncing on a waterbed while fighting for balance at the same time. Once they got accustomed, they developed a unique method of walking that is different from how we walk on the Earth. To make their footsteps faster, they would lurch from one foot to the other. While this walking did look funny, it helped astronauts who followed to better walk on the moon. But despite that, the astronauts also learned that moon dust is extremely slippery to walk on. Armstrong later said that he was always looking ahead 2 or 3 steps away to avoid slipping or falling over. As funny as their walking looked, it became one of their favorite activities when they were on the moon's surface.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The American flag. Among all the incredible accomplishments, planting the American flag was among the most important. Nobody knew how hard the moon's surface would be. The flagpole itself only went into the ground a couple of inches, but still managed to stand despite the lack of steady mounting. Somehow the lack of atmosphere worked out and Armstrong could salute the flag with pride. When it came time to leave, though, the landing module had one switch that would help fire the engine to boost them off the surface. Aldrin accidentally broke a circuit breaker switch that was needed to activate the booster. He thought quickly and used a felt-tip pen to solve this problem. It worked. And as they ascended upward, they could see the blast from their window. Sadly, the force from the booster knocked the American flag over. No one saw this except Buzz Aldrin, who watched in dismay. Astronaut quarantine. After their return trip home to Earth, the astronauts were welcomed home like heroes. But out of fear of the unknown, they went into a mandatory quarantine. Nobody was sure if the moon dust was toxic, so they treated it like a virus. All 3 astronauts were immediately scrubbed down with sodium hypochlorite and betadine to remove any moon dust. After that, they were sent to live in a custom-designed mobile trailer called the Hornet for 21 days. Although the 3 weeks of confinement was tough at times, they had everything they needed inside to weather through the days and nights that passed. The Hornet was sealed and prevented any exposure to anyone here on Earth until the health of the astronauts could be guaranteed. After a little more than 3 weeks, the final quarantine was lifted and the astronauts could finally come home. Moon conspiracies. It's been nearly 50 years since the very last mission to the moon in 1972, and there's hope to return once again. But that doesn't stop some people from thinking it was all a big hoax. Over the years, there have been a growing number of people who don't understand basic physics and gravity to know that outer space flight is real rocket science. Some insist that the moon landing was faked to fool Russia and the world into believing that men went to the moon. Some will even go so far as to say that famous director Stanley Kubrick was hired along with the Walt Disney Animation Company to create fake moon landing footage. Some believe this is true, but that the footage was only created in case something went wrong with the actual landing. While we may never know the truth, it's tough to argue with the legacy of the 1969 moon landing. Now we'd like to hear from you. Do you think the moon landing was faked? Or do you believe it really happened? Tell us in the comments below. And if you liked this video, subscribe to FactsVerse for more videos. Thanks for watching.